Over the past weeks and months, I've been asked many times if I could make a camera comparison between the GoPro Hero 8 and the iPhone. Unfortunately, I don't have a current iPhone 11 available in this quarantine situation. But I can show you a comparison with the iPhone XR, and maybe this comparison is even more appropriate since the devices are rather in the similar price range. I'm aware that these are two completely different devices, and that this is a literal comparison between apples and oranges. The GoPro is an action cam with a rugged and waterproof body and a huge ecosystem of mounts. The iPhone, which is a smartphone, is of course much more than a camera, although it must be said that the camera has become a very important component. But especially if you are not necessarily looking for a camera for skiing or diving, but rather for a camera, for example, for travel videos, both devices could very well be suitable, and it could be quite interesting to see how the shots look in direct comparison. As always, you will find links for both devices in the video description, so that you can compare the current prices and offers. And for the case you are new here, my name is Werner, I live in the Italian Alps, and this channel is about filmmaking, GoPro and other consumer cameras. Consider subscribing if you're interested in these topics and have fun with this video. Today I will concentrate exclusively on the video quality. Besides the overall image quality, I will show you what results the different focal lengths of the lenses lead to. I will also compare shots in 4K 60 and slow motion recordings. I will then test the cameras in low light as well. All today's shots were taken in the respective standard mode. This is especially relevant for the GoPro, which would allow many different settings. To get more control over the settings of the iPhone, there are also specific apps. What you might also want to know is that the iPhone recordings were made in high efficiency mode. With these first images, it becomes clear that both cameras are able to shoot amazing footage in 4K. At the same time, you can see the biggest difference between the two cameras: the focal length. The GoPro with 16mm has a much wider field of view than the iPhone XR with 28mm. Here you can see another comparison with the field of view linear, which is supposed to correct the distortions of the fisheye lens of the GoPro. Even with the field of view linear, the GoPro's field of view is much wider. All further shots that follow were taken with the field of view wide. And all shots were taken from the same distance, so you can get a good idea of how the different focal lengths affect you in practice. If we pay special attention to the colors in the next shot, we can see relatively clearly that the iPhone uses a cooler white balance, just like in the last shot. The images of the iPhone have considerably more blue tones than the images of the GoPro, which appear warmer here. The colors of the GoPro are also clearly deeper and more saturated. This can be seen very clearly in the blue of the sky or the green of the grass. These shots should show you again the big difference in focal length. Interesting about this shot of the tree is that the sky in the GoPro shot tends to be cyan, which with the GoPro is especially the case when the sky is rather brightly exposed. The automatic exposure of the two cameras is only partially comparable, because both use a different frame for the exposure metering. What is noticeable in the shots of these close-up of the flowers is that you can create a slight background blur with the iPhone, something that is not possible with a GoPro due to the wider lens. These shots were taken in 4K 60 and then slowed down to 40%. Apart from the previous differences in color and white balance, it's easy to see that the stabilization of the iPhone doesn't work as well in 4K 60. The footage looks a little shaky, even though it's only played back at 40% speed. In contrast, you can easily make steady videos in 4K 60 with the GoPro. Only the boost mode is not available. I should add at this point, however, that a wide-angle lens will always have advantages in stabilization. What is still noticeable in this recording when you look at the brightly lit houses in the background is that the iPhone protects the highlights a bit better. Already with the other shots, it was noticeable that the highlights burn out a bit faster with the GoPro in certain situations. The difference is however small, but we will come to the dynamic range in a moment. Here you can see how both cameras behave when you shoot directly into the sun. The iPhone produces clearly more sun flares, whereby the sun also takes up considerably more space in the image. This shot was also taken in 4K 60, and what I also notice in this comparison is that the iPhone in general produces significantly more compression artifacts in 4K 60. We will see that later on in another recording. That would be these ugly areas here, which are caused by the camera trying to reduce the memory space to a minimum. In general, I would like to mention here that the iPhone apparently compresses more aggressively and thus produces much smaller file sizes. When it comes to evaluating colors, skin tones are certainly the most important color tone. When we look at this shot, we notice that the skin tones on the iPhone look a little more reddish than the skin tones of the GoPro. What I don't like about the GoPro in this shot is that you can clearly see on the face that there is too much artificial sharpening going on. The image looks more digital and artificial. In any case, I would recommend to reduce the sharpness in the settings of the GoPro. As far as skin tones are concerned, I also have the impression that the iPhone has a bit more color depth. The image generally looks a bit better, even if I like the color tone itself a little bit better in the GoPro shot. But this is rather a matter of taste. Now let's take a closer look at the dynamic range. So how well can the cameras handle situations where there are very bright and at the same time very dark areas in the same frame? This indoor shot here is definitely an extreme situation. In both shots the bright areas around the window burn out. However, it must be said that the iPhone has a little more dynamic range. The whole image and the face is exposed brighter, but you can still see a little more detail in the window when you look at the forest, for example. Now I've set exposure to the window, and also in this case the iPhone's image has a more dynamic range. My nephew David is better exposed in the shot of the iPhone. At the same time the highlights are better protected. However, the image taken with the iPhone has this somewhat artificial HDR look. The shot has more dynamic range but doesn't look very natural. In this outdoor shot in the garden, the image of the iPhone also has a little more dynamic range. Although the difference isn't as noticeable here, and the GoPro also has the sun in the frame, which makes the exposure even more difficult. Then I took a few shots in low light. The shots of both cameras show immediately that they are not the best choice for capturing video in low light. This is simply due to the small sensors, which do not get enough light in these bad lighting conditions. The iPhone exposes a little bit brighter and still has a little bit less noise, even if you probably can't see that on YouTube. When it gets very dark, like in this case, both shots are so noisy that they are actually unusable. Here you can see a shot in artificial light. Also in this case the image of the iPhone is clearly brighter, this although it has less noise. In low light I would therefore rather use the iPhone, although both cameras are not the ideal solution. Now I will show you some slow motion shots in 1080. First at 120 frames per second and then at 240 frames per second. The shot of the iPhone is exposed a bit brighter, but you can see the reduced image quality immediately in all of the shots. At 120 frames I would have a hard time telling which shot looks better. At 240 frames per second I like the image of the GoPro better. It has more details and looks cleaner when you look at the ball or the grass. But it also has more digital sharpness, which you can reduce in the settings. As for slow motion, I would also recommend that you use 2.7K and 120 frames per second when using the GoPro. This will give you a much better image. There is no such option on the iPhone. Now let's take a look at the stabilization and you will see there is a clear difference. First I will show you some shots in 4K and 24 frames per second and then in 4K and 60 frames per second. The stabilization of the GoPro is set to high. Already when walking you can see that the GoPro stabilizes the footage better, even if the shot of the iPhone still looks quite acceptable. When running, however, the difference is huge. The GoPro footage still looks good, while you can't actually use the shot of the iPhone anymore. The iPhone also produces heavy compression artifacts in this difficult situation. These are too many small details that have to be processed in a short time. The image becomes pixelated and very ugly, even if it might look a little different on YouTube. On my monitor, the image of the GoPro still looks very clean. Please don't forget that YouTube adds another compression to the video to reduce the storage space even further. In 4K and 60 frames per second, the same weaknesses of the iPhone show up even stronger. The image already looks quite shaky when walking and even stronger compression artifacts appear. So let's recap the most important findings in a few sentences. Both cameras can capture amazing footage, especially in 4K and in good lighting conditions. The biggest difference is the focal length and therefore the field of view. This difference alone makes a direct comparison difficult. The footage also differs in white balance and saturation. What looks better is of course a matter of taste. I would describe the somewhat better dynamic range as one of the strengths of the iPhone. I also like the iPhone a little better in low light, although both cameras are not particularly suitable for this. I would also reduce the GoPro's strong digital sharpness in the settings. For slow motion shots, I would prefer the GoPro, also because it has an additional mode with 2.7K and 120 frames per second, which leads to clearly better results. As far as image stabilization is concerned, the GoPro has clear advantages. The shots are completely stable, even with very strong movements. The GoPro also has fewer problems with compression artifacts, which are especially noticeable on the iPhone with 4K and 60 frames per second. And that's it for today. If the video was interesting for you, give me a like as feedback, stay safe and see you next time.